So, you know the meme of how, like, two kids will get in a fight and then the teacher will come break it up and be like, well, I hope you're happy because now you're both going to the principal's office. This feels a little bit like that, but also it involves a lot of mutual intellectual dishonesty, which is something that I do not particularly care for, especially in people that are purporting to educate the public. And it's sort of, I don't want to say I'm more taking either side, but I was a much longer term subscriber to Veritasium than I ever was to Tom Nichols. I've been watching Veritasium videos on and off for years, but I only started watching Tom Nichols videos for like a few months, and I watched the one where he was like, digging into Veritasium, and he made a lot of good points, but he also made a couple of they weren't mistakes, they were deliberate omissions that would have weakened his argument, and I still think he would have had a good argument, but that's what intellectual dishonesty is all about. It's about, instead of putting your best foot forward and then bringing the other, truths along and saying, here's, my argument, and here's all these caveats and all these potential, counter arguments, and here's how I'm addressing them. You just say, here's the cool part of my argument. Oh, and ignore all those other things that might make it more difficult to, come to the same conclusion as me. And so I find that extremely frustrating. I find it extremely dishonest, and I am not interested in watching more content from a creator who does that. I'm willing to sort of forgive that if they sort of, stop doing it. But when I have no evidence that they're going to stop doing it, then I have no interest in continuing to watch their videos. And that's the case for both Tom Nichols and Veritasium. Because Veritasium is somebody that he's obviously a lot more similar to me. He's also a physicist. He tends to ask sort of semi pedantic but potentially meaningful questions. But he'd actually been getting on my nerves for a while because he tends to do things where he'll phrase questions in an intentionally ambiguous manner to try to, like, it's not necessarily so that he can feel, it's not just so that he can feel smugly more intelligent than the person that he's interacting with, although that's often the case. It's also so that he can help the audience feel smugly more intelligent than, whomever else. And I don't know. It's that had just been bugging me for a while, but I'd been letting it go because I was like, well, okay, but at least he's still, technically correct most of the time, and like, just because I find it off-putting doesn't mean it's wrong. All right, whatever. Um, but then we get to the video in question, which was the Waymo video, and that contained enough things that were blatantly staged and contained enough arguments that were erroneous, incomplete, and doing exactly the thing that I'm saying Tom Nichols did with his takedown, where you just ignore any evidence that goes against your argument and sweep it under the rug. If your argument doesn't hold up under scrutiny, that's probably because it's just not true, and you should rethink it. But when there's money involved, people don't do that, and that's where Tom Nichols was absolutely right. Is it? I don't even remember if it's Tom Nichols or Nicholas. You see, yeah, again, I wasn't even subscribed to him for that long. Here's the thing about the takedown, though. So they're talking about something that I am deeply familiar with, which is the incident involving the 777 that crashed, or on the runway at San Francisco International Airport. And it was a discussion over whether automation was to blame or human factors were to blame, and the answer was both. Right? Most NTSB reports going into different accidents and incidents come to the conclusion that there were multiple factors involved. And in this case, it was the interaction of automation with a misunderstanding on the part of the pilots as to how that automation worked. And you really need to present both sides of that, because it's not as simple as automation good or automation bad. It's, what I will typically argue, which is that automation is useful, but only to the extent that we as human beings use it in an intelligent manner. And this was a case where, the automation wasn't perfect and it had some design flaws, and the pilots misunderstood, as a result of those sort of design oversights, how the automation actually worked. Because Tom Nichols made it out to be that, the aircraft's automated systems all failed and that's why there was this problem. And that's not true at all. In fact, uh, the flight computer operated pretty much as designed. It's just that the way that it was designed to interact with the pilots had some flaws. They were ergonomic flaws, not actual technical faults with the automation, but nevertheless. And then conversely, on the Veretasium side, he did try to just basically blame it all on the pilots, and it's like, well, that's not really true either. The way the auto throttle was designed, it was confusing and ambiguous as to whether or not it was actually engaged. And as a result, the pilots didn't realize how slow they were. And it is very much the case that the pilots should have realized. They should have been, proper aircrew and been looking at their airspeed. And, regardless of what the computer was doing, they should have noticed that they were slow. Conversely, on an airliner as sophisticated as the 777, the computer should have been making it, blaringly clear to them that, hey, the auto throttle is not engaged, you are getting extremely slow, you need to do something about that ASAP. But it didn't. And so they were unable to pitch up when they started getting close to the runway, and they were fortunate that they didn't stall and crash short of the runway. So, I'm just very frustrated with both Veretasium and Tom Nichols for just presenting the side of the argument that was convenient for them. And as far as Waymo goes, yeah, Veretasium was blatantly shilling for them and covering up any deficiencies whatsoever and raving about how much he loved the automated taxi experience, and then being like, oh yeah, by the way, this video is sponsored by Waymo, which just happens to be owned by Google, which just happens to own YouTube. It's like, you think that might be relevant information to make very clear to the audience, but so I'd been getting frustrated with him for a while, but I'd been putting it, I've been trying to sort of put it aside and be like, okay, just because I'm frustrated with him doesn't mean he's wrong or dishonest. It just means that it's, maybe in a style that I don't like. But then this whole thing happened. I was like, no, he actually is kind of intentionally dishonest for the sake of his own personal gains. And I don't think he's completely a bad guy, but I do think he's intellectually dishonest, and when you have a huge platform like that, I think that is a actual genuine ethical oversight. As far as Tom Nichols goes, I don't think I need to go into as much detail on why I don't like him. He does the same thing, but he doesn't even try, right? He's presenting arguments that are largely sociological and political, and in that arena, everybody kind of already knows how deficient facts usually are, so it's probably not as surprising. But I've seen plenty of his videos where he'll say something and I explicitly know it's not true, and it's clear that he just hasn't researched the topic, and he's just saying whatever favors his argument. And, he's doing something that the human brain tends to do, which is that when we don't have all the details of something, we just fill them in with whatever makes sense to us. And if you genuinely can't get that information, that's kind of the best you can do. But one, you need to be aware that you have sort of filled in the gaps and that you don't actually have that detail, and you're going to need to check for it in the future. And B, we have the internet now. It takes 5 seconds to look something up. So anyways, I unsubscribed from both of them. I would consider watching their videos again in the future if I see evidence that they have improved their fact-checking. But until such time as that happens, yeah, they're both getting detention.